So today we're going to look at the dragon heart tessellation. And this tessellation was originally discovered by Helena Verrill, who's actually a friend of mine. And when I mentioned to her that I wanted to teach this in a video, I told her that I was going to teach it by putting in each element one at a time instead of pre-creasing everything and collapsing. So she's also interested in seeing what this means for this tessellation that has always really been seen as you're going to fold a square grid and then you're going to pre-crease. You're going to fold each of these specific diagonals and then collapse. So the first thing we're going to do, we're starting from a completely blank square sheet of paper, and I'm using Skytone. I'll make sure to put a link in the description of where you can get some. And this sheet is 12.5 inches. We're going to exactly replicate this. So if you already know how to fold a 16-fold double diagonal square grid, or 16-fold double diagonal 45-degree grid, these are basically the same thing, you can go ahead and skip to that part once you have your grid. But for now, I'm going to fold in half. And so the two key parts of that name, 16-fold double diagonal square grid, are the 16 and the double diagonal. So what the 16 tells me is that I'm going to be doing divisions of 2. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is 16. And so once I have my half, I'll fold the bottom edge up to the center, using my bone folder to fold all the way through, opening up, rotating halfway around. I'll bring the new bottom edge up to the center. And at this point, instead of doing all 16 divisions in one direction, I'm going to rotate and do another direction. But first, I'm going to flip the paper over and reverse each of these creases, because what we want here is for our grid to be very flexible. We don't want any particular fold line to only have been folded as a valley or only have been folded as a mountain, because it's harder to manipulate the way that we need it. So once I have these folds all neutralized, I'm going to rotate, and here I'm on the same side of the paper that I originally used for my valleys. It's a little hard to tell because my paper is the same color on both sides, but this is just a personal preference, and if you're doing like very high precision stuff, then it might start mattering that all of your grid lines are folded on the same side of the paper, but it doesn't make a huge difference for this scale. So I'm doing those exact same folds in the other direction. And so that's setting us well on our way to 16 divisions. And I'm going to neutralize these creases as well. So I flip the paper over and I'm turning them all into valleys on the other side. And now is the part where we add the diagonals. So I'm going to bring one corner of the paper up to meet the opposite corner. And I'm paying attention as I fold to the two corners that I'm folding through as well, making sure that those are nice, crisp corners. And this will be another grid direction. So I'm going to open up and bring the corner into the center as well. One thing that I'm making sure of is that the grid line that is on the top flap I'm making sure that line is lining up with the grid line on the bottom flap for both this direction and this other direction. That's going to guarantee that my new fold passes through my grid intersection. And it's more important than whether the corner of the paper comes exactly to the center. So I'm going to rotate halfway around and bring the opposite corner also into the center. You'll notice that I'm always folding away from me. This is just so I have better visuals on what's arriving where. These folds will also get neutralized. So I'm going to flip the paper over and reverse each of those creases, and returning to the valley side of the grid, I'm going to rotate halfway around so I can do the next set of diagonals. So I'm folding in half from corner to opposite corner, folding all the way through. And one thing, like the reason I'm using the bone folder is because you really want all of your grid lines to be very crisp. You cannot get your grid lines too crisp. I mean, depending on your paper, you'll have more or less strength on the fold line to be able to fold it back and forth on that fold line multiple times. But like I said, Skytone is an excellent paper to start with, but this pattern and all of the beginner patterns can really be folded on any kind of paper. Like I would use Kami for this too. So you're not limited by the paper that you have access to when you're trying to learn origami tessellations. Although I will say that using a medium to thick paper like Skytone does make the process a bit easier. So now that we've done one set of diagonals in each direction, and we did the same number of folds for the diagonals as we did for the horizontals and verticals, we're in a state that I call single diagonal. For each horizontal, vertical grid square, we have one diagonal fold. Now in our end state, we're going to end up with two diagonals through each grid square. And while we're on the diagonal directions, I may as well go ahead and do another round of diagonals. We're always doing divisions of 2 as we go to this 16-fold double diagonal square grid, or 45-degree grid. And so we can do any direction that we want next. I'm just doing the diagonal direction next because that's how we were already holding the paper. And so you'll notice I'm taking each section and bringing it to the next section, or each grid line bringing it to the next grid line. I'm dividing each section directly in half. And flipping over, I'll reverse the new creases. So we'll see a slightly different method of dividing spaces in half as we get skinnier and skinnier spaces. So now this diagonal direction has 8 divisions. I'm going to go to the other diagonal direction that still has 4 and divide each of those spaces in half. And notice I'm picking this middle grid line up as a mountain and bringing it to the next grid line out. I could have also picked up that further grid line out and brought it to the center. Mathematically, they're equivalent. Rotating around, I want to bring the point into the next grid line because it's really hard to fold a line to a point, but a lot easier to fold a point to a specific point on a line. And flipping over, I'll neutralize these new creases. So now every grid square has both directions of diagonals. And if we want to return to a single diagonal grid, all we need to do is divide our grid squares in half. So that's what we're going to do next. We have 4 divisions, horizontally and vertically. We're going for 16 in the end. So I'll divide in half now to get to 8. And again, I'm picking up the next grid line as a mountain and bringing it to the next fold over. And this means that all of my references inside of the grid are very local. I'm not relying on things that are far away from the fold that I'm making. And so we're going to be folding for a bit here. I've got the 8ths in one direction. And rotating to the other edge parallel direction, I'm going to do the 8ths there as well. And picking up the next grid line, I'll bring that up to the following grid line. Use my bone folder to really smooth that out, then pick up the next, and repeat that process all the way across until I would be folding a grid line to the edge of the paper. And I'd rather do that the opposite way, so I'll rotate halfway around so I can see exactly where that edge is relative to the next grid line. I can also see how my folds are continuing from the top flap to the bottom flap. And flipping over, I'll neutralize these creases as well. So now we've returned to a single diagonal state. For every grid square, there is a single diagonal in that square. And we're going to go a little bit further. So we did 8ths here, we're going for 16ths in total. And I'm going to introduce a slightly different technique for getting halves. So you notice as I'm going along this bottom edge, it took me several stages of setup and flatten to get that fold all the way across the paper on this really skinny strip. So what I'm going to do is, instead of picking up the next grid line, I'm going to keep picking up the edge, and I'm going to bring that 1, 2, 3 spaces up. So 3 is an odd number, which means that when you divide it in half, you get 1 and a half. And so you don't really have to worry about accidentally going to an even number, because an even number, when you divide it, is just a whole number. You already have the whole numbers. And so we're picking up the next grid line in and going 1, 2, 3 spaces above that. And who said math isn't useful in real life? So we're peeling back until we have just one skinny division left folded, and then taking that mountain fold 2 spaces forward, because it's already at the first one. It needs 2 and 3. And this is something that I call the 3/2 method, because it's taking 3 spaces and dividing it in half. And we're going to repeat this process all the way across until we would be folding a grid line to the edge of the paper. So I've got another repeat left before that would be the case. So this 3/2 method I teach inside of Tessellation Foundations, and I actually do another round of divisions as well and include the 5/2 method, which you might be able to guess what that involves from the name. So when we would have been folding that mountain fold to the edge, I'm instead going to flip around and fold the edge up to that fold. And open up, and that last division at the edge we do need to fold directly in half. No way around that. So now we've got 16 in this direction. We need 16 in the other edge parallel direction. And we also need to get up to double diagonals. So that'll be one more round of divisions for the, well, I just rotated it so it's horizontal, and then 2 more rounds of divisions for the diagonals. So I'm doing my first division directly in half. My second division, the fold that's going to go through here between the first and second grid lines, that is going to be exactly 1.5. So I can go and bring my edge up to the third grid line, to the top of the third division, or space, however you choose to think about it, and fold all the way through. And we're going to continue with that 3/2 method all the way across. And so since we are adding the diagonals to the square grid, and we're not just adding one diagonal per grid square, we're adding both diagonals, double diagonals, it is going to take a little bit longer to do our grid than if we had just done the square grid. But it's going to be so much easier to do our folding, and it's going to be easier if you're trying to reverse engineer, if you don't have the crease pattern. So not just for this pattern, but for other origami tessellations that are based on the square grid with diagonals. It's much easier to reverse engineer other people's patterns if you're using a square grid with diagonals. And then if you are trying to figure out like what is the arrangement of folds that someone has used, there's a lesson in tessellation foundations that really helps with that as well. It's on right triangle intersections, and it basically shows you like what's the connection between the crease pattern and the folded form for a variety of different ways of arranging pleats on the square grid with diagonals. So one thing to mention as I'm reversing folds here, as I'm neutralizing these folds, is I'm only reversing the latest folds. Everything that's been reversed previously can just stay that way. I don't need to fold it back and forth again. So now I've finished my horizontals and verticals, and I need to do another 2 rounds of diagonals, because if you look at these grid squares, only half of them have any diagonals at all. And I'm going for 2 diagonals in each of those grid squares. So I need to do 2 divisions for each diagonal direction. I'm going to do a division in one direction, and then that same division in the other direction, then do the second division in first one direction and then the other. And here again, it can be helpful to use the 3/2 method, where we can pick up a mountain fold and bring it 3 grid spaces over and fold through, so we can spread our thumbs just once instead of setting up a little bit and flattening a little bit, then setting up more and flattening a bit more. So that's the real benefit of the 3/2 method. I can get all the way across in one pass of my thumbs. Now here, I could bring this edge all the way up to that next position that's 3 away, but that's a really small space and this one's really big, so I'd rather rotate around, and I could even bring that one up and in, so now I can see everything that's going on. Particularly, I can see this already existing grid line lining up with the grid line underneath, which is an excellent sign that I've actually folded my target division in half. And I can continue working my way out to the edge. And then I'll neutralize or reverse all of my new creases. And a little bit of information, if this is your first time or even like 5th or 10th time folding a grid, I'm probably folding it faster than you can, or faster than you can accurately. And I'm specifically doing that because this is a recorded video. The replay will be up as soon as I'm done with the live stream. But also because I have folded hundreds, if not thousands, of grids. This is a process that does get faster with practice. Another thing that's helping me is the lighting that I have here at my desk. So I have light coming in from the top. You can see on the back of my hand that's facing towards the light. And so I'm able to see my folds clearer than if I did not have that light on. So if you're struggling with seeing the folds in the paper, consider getting a lamp and putting it kind of in front of and to the side of you and have that shining onto your paper. I've heard from other folders that particularly having a low angle, so having that lamp have the light come in kind of at this angle instead of this angle, is particularly helpful in seeing folds. And rotating around, I'll finish up the folds in this direction. Another tip for particularly people who are just starting to fold grids is find a way to backlight while you are folding the grid. Now this could be on like a light table. There's tablets for tracing drawings that also work for backlighting your grid. And that'll really help you see alignment of folds on different flats. It's something that my students found very helpful in the beginning. And then after they used it for a while, they were able to fold accurately without it. So now I have single diagonals in each grid square. And I'm going for double diagonals because that's what this particular pattern requires. And don't worry, it won't shrink this small. I was starting with a smaller paper for the demo. And so we need to do another round of divisions. And it might be a little bit confusing for you when you look at the paper diagonally. It looks like each grid square has two diagonals. And each diagonal square does. But when we're naming our grid, we're specifically looking at the horizontal and vertical squares. So that's kind of the difference between single diagonal and double diagonal. It's a difference of perspective. And also more diagonals. And so I'm going to be folding lots of divisions, lots of grid lines. So one fun fact about grids, when you're dividing in two every time, the number of new grid lines that you put in is the number of grid lines you already have in that direction plus one. So effectively, when you do another division, like if you're doing a division on all of your grid directions, that is going to take you as long as the total of how long you've taken so far. So there's some exponentials for you. Again, who said math isn't helpful? So you can kind of predict how long a grid is going to take by saying, okay, I've done all but the last direction in all grid directions. How long was that? And double it. So when you're on the last step, you are halfway there. Which might sound depressing, but it becomes pretty meditative after a while. You can see that my hands are mostly working autonomously here, and I'm able to riff on whatever I want to say while I'm gridding. So, like I was saying earlier, not only will you become faster at gridding as you practice, you will also be able to split your attention and maybe hold a conversation or listen to a podcast or even watch a YouTube video. Although I will say videos that are conveying information, that's mostly listening to the audio. work a lot better than videos where you actually need to look at the screen a lot. So whenever I have office hours with my students and we're all gridding, it's always a nice chatty time where we can discuss whatever's going on and whatever projects we're thinking about or have tried out recently. And whatever else might be going on in life. I should also mention that several of my courses have office hours. Basic Twist Bootcamp would be the best one if you're at the level for this video. It's introducing basic twists, like the name implies, and how to practice them. So you can fold whatever tessellation you like once you can see and understand how those basic twists are working. And I'll also mention that the rate of learning, the rate of understanding for origami tessellations is different for every person. Just because you're not learning as fast as, say, the person next to you at a convention, doesn't mean that you can't learn tessellations. It might mean that the way that that instructor is teaching isn't a good fit for you. It could mean any number of things, but it's not something that will prevent you from learning tessellations in the long run. So now we have one more direction of diagonals to complete. And we're just going to work our way across. I'm using the 3/2 method on these diagonals as well. And I see Erlu is mentioning in the comments that he's thinking of buying a backlighting tablet for a couple months now, and it's time to actually do it. So yeah, it's one of those things that can be very helpful, especially, I'm going to say, especially if you're using smaller paper, especially if you're using thinner paper, because that's where precision matters most, is in those tiny sizes. So I was talking about how quickly people learn origami tessellations. And it really, really depends on the person. Some people will need just one example of like, okay, this is how you fold this particular twist, and then they can see it in any pattern that uses it. Other people will need more concrete examples of like, okay, here's how we're going to practice this twist in a tessellation. And let's practice it in 5 different tessellations. And we'll start seeing consistent patterns between tessellations. So that's more what my tessellation starter sequence goes into, where, for example, there's a whole bunch of lessons just on different ways of choosing hexagon and triangle twists that alternate each other. I think I have like 4 or 5 different versions of that out of the 8 alternating patterns that are possible with the 2 simplest hexagons and 2 simplest triangles. And so when you have more practice, that also gives me as an instructor time to talk through some more of the abstractions that I'm using that are informing why I'm folding how I'm folding. So if you wanted to be an independent folder who can reverse engineer things, you're going to need to know how to see the twists. Or in this case, in patterns like these, how to see those intersections of pleats on a 45-degree grid. And you'll also need to know how to emulate that in your own paper. So this is one of the things that we're going to be looking at today. So I'll just neutralize this last set of creases. And I should mention, before I move into the piece for today, that Tessellation Foundations, the one I was talking about that has more gridding lessons and more beginner projects, that one's completely free. Like, you can go to training.gatheringfolds.com/start, put in your name and email, and you get access to all of it immediately. I just did an update on all of those videos, so it's brand new, well, not so much brand new information, but how I choose to teach it now that I've been teaching origami tessellations for a couple years, as opposed to how I taught it the first time ever, which you can also see. Those videos are still there. So, making our tessellation. The first thing I'm going to do is define where the center of the piece is. And for this one, the center, I'm going to mark my center so I can zoom in. The center of the piece is going to be on that corner there. So what I need to know in order to fold that corner, so we're going to be starting in the middle, doing a stripe up and down, and then working our way side to side. This corner is kind of 2 different corners put together. So if I grab well, I did have a sample grid. Oh, maybe my sample grid. Okay. There we go. That one will work. You can tell I do a lot of this. So that corner is composed of 2 parts. It is part of, and actually I'm going to need to rotate this diagonally so I have all of the folds that I need, because this demo grid here is single diagonal, so I needed to rotate. It's got this 3-way intersection of mountains that has been mirrored on both sides. So we're able to do just half of that intersection. Notice this bit right here is the same as we see over here. And we're able to get half of it at once and continue on from there. So what's going on here is we've got kind of this one leg of a water bomb base with valleys around it that's tucking under this pleat going diagonally down. And then we have this other pleat going freely diagonally up, and the horizontal going straight out to the side. So I'm going to replicate that on my full grid, where I will have the horizontal coming in from the left. And I'll just draw on really quick where these diagonals are. And we're going to get that diagonal continuing in the next grid spacing over. So I'm going to bring up my horizontal. I'm going to split that horizontal in the two diagonal directions. And I'm going to make sure that both that endpoint of the lower right diagonal and the endpoint of the diagonal in the same direction that over to the right is also down, and those two are going to collapse in. I need to also make sure that I have my valleys down below everything. It's going to collapse in and become flat. So now I need to know, okay, how do I repeat this? So I'm going to come back to my reference piece, and it's going to tell me, okay, if I'm going up from here, I have 2 grid spacings. So 2 grid spacings on here before that drops down into this space. Okay, so if I open that up a little bit, that point is dropping down. I'm going to have another mountain spaced a little bit to the right. So the next grid square over, I'm going to have my new mountain fold, and that's the one that's going to bounce off and continue on up. And then I'll have horizontal going out to the right. So these two pieces are really everything that's going on in the entire tessellation. We're going to be repeating this over and over as we work our way up and then down for this stripe. And then we're going to be mirroring copies as we go over. So some variations that you could do, you could put these further apart. You could have the mirror symmetry line further over. You can have some kind of different spacing on different diagonal directions. Really, the choice is yours. But for right now, I'm going to get us to the next repeat by saying, okay, from this intersection of mountains, I'm going 2 diagonal spaces. Now this is specifically diagonal spaces across whole grid squares. There's other grid lines in between that you could think of as 1 spacing, but I'm going to say 2 grid squares corners away. That one is going to drop down. The parallel diagonal in the next grid square to the left is going to become a mountain as well. And it's going to have that three-way intersection. And if we've done things correctly, then this one's going to line up exactly on top of that one. So then we can repeat this going all the way up with another intersection that again should come straight over the one below, because we need to have them aligned for our mirror symmetry to work out. And for this last one, I could bring up that little bit, but I'm going to leave it be for right now until we get more repeats in place, because it'll just pop down and pop back up. It's not something that we need to worry about right now. So then continuing on down, in this direction, I'm coming out from the pocket. So this is coming directly to the three-way intersection. And then the next diagonal is over inside the pocket. And again, coming 2 spaces, this is the three-way intersection. And that next diagonal, so the diagonal coming down is popping down kind of into a hole, 1 grid square diagonal away. And then we can bring out our full intersection. And once more, I'm getting that horizontal well in place, and then bringing up and closing the fold inside the pocket. And now we get to mirror over to another part of the paper. I'm going to work over here, and I'm going to choose to work from the top on down my levels somewhat arbitrarily, but I think it'll make it slightly easier. So what I just did is I took this corner, that three-way intersection, and I turned it more explicitly into a water bomb setup. And then I can run my diagonal down. If I had more paper, it would cross through all of these horizontal folds. And then 2 spaces out, I'm going to do the same thing with my next location. And for this one, when I'm setting up the fold, my fold in the pocket is coming and hitting directly at the tip. So I could have predicted that in advance. And then I also want to add that fold in the pocket for the next intersection as well. So when we do these outer ones, we're also going to get the inner pieces too. We need to remember that we're doing the same things on both sides of the intersection. So that little mountain fold leg is only going to go across 1 grid square before popping down. And so we're able to collapse the pattern very smoothly And by the way, the pattern will, the grid will tell you if you're not on the right grid intersections. Like, I just tried to make an intersection here, and it's like, no, you don't have a horizontal. So the paper will let you know if something's going to work or not. And then I can get that next stripe. So from here, I can continue adding layer upon layer. Up above here, I can have my next kind of pieces lining up, if I so choose. And I can use my bone folder to help everything stay a little bit more flat, so it's not trying to undo itself. You can see it's expanding very slowly when I let it go. And at this stage, I don't have any more like actual intersections going on out here. So it's more a matter of just finishing each edge bit how I see fit. And then down here, I could also tuck that corner as well. And I'm making sure to tuck this flap back out because it's just one pleat that's being tucked under, and I wouldn't want that extra corner to interfere with the backlighting of the piece. So then here on the left-hand side, I'm going to continue, again, starting at the top. And I mean, you can see how helpful it is to be able to work with both hands at the same time on these origami tessellations. And here, heading up into the top, I do actually want to get that kind of more squared away as I'm setting up the rest of this, or else there would just be a giant blank space. And I can pop down that little corner or that little bit of the edge as well. And yeah, as Early was saying in the chat, this is one that's been around that a lot of people have tried before. But a lot of people have tried to collapse directly from the crease pattern, which is much harder than adding in diagonals on the grid, because you don't have the flexibility and you don't necessarily, well, you don't have the flexibility to do that. For example, you wouldn't have that diagonal line going all the way out. And so using grid diagonals is a much smoother experience for collapsing this pattern than pre-creasing on a square grid. I see this flap got flipped. There we have the point down below. And I'll just finish out these creases. I'll back off the zoom a little bit because you've seen the detail of how this is happening. So I'm making sure that my point looks like a water bomb base. And then I have that extra fold coming out. When I put in the three-way intersection on that extra fold, I make sure that I have a new fold heading out to the next point. And then I also need to identify the extra fold and repeat over however much grid you have. And this is the kind of thing where if you're not particularly comfortable working with your left hand, you may want to rotate the paper around and work on your right hand side. This is a particular skill that I've picked up after years of tessellation folding, of being able to work on things pretty much from either side of the paper. And yeah, it is very satisfying, as Orlu is saying, to learn, like, oh, there is an easier way to do this. It's not all like struggle and stress and will it work out. It can be quite relaxing to fold these origami tessellations. And for me, the most relaxing way is to fold one pattern element at a time. So this is the dragon heart tessellation, and that heart bit is coming from the backlighting, which you can see here. We've got all those lovely hearts inside the scales. And if I flip over, we can see those hearts on the other side too, from a more scale-like perspective. Now, if you want, so you can see that this pattern is really curling, and it's popping open, and it's a little bit unruly. If you wanted to get that to stay flat, putting it under a stack of books for a couple days typically works. And you can also steam iron it. Like, I'd recommend putting it under books for a bit and then put it between like two pieces of fabric, and then you can steam iron, and that'll really get it to stay flat. And I should mention, I haven't tried steam ironing myself, but I've heard from other people that it works well. You might want to test your specific paper, like test a scrap sheet of paper, because steam can change the color of paper sometimes. So happy folding, everyone. Definitely check out Tessellation Foundations if you're interested in more projects like this. And see you in the next video.